I was at tables where generally I was the only person in favor mostly of residential education, and people were very chill, and it was very open, and a lot of the stuff that was brought up didn't specifically have to do with pastoral formation. And that's where I think part of the temperature on this issue is because it's a proxy for a lot of other things for anybody. It's not strictly speaking about pragmatic academic questions like how many credits should you require before someone gets through an academic program.
Welcome to Synod Stories, a show about the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, its past, present, and future. I started this podcast to look at the issues that are likely to be addressed at the LCMS National Convention. One of those issues is pastoral formation. And to talk about that, I have Dr. Adam Koontz, who is pastor at Redeemer Lutheran Church in Oakmont, Pennsylvania, and one of the hosts of the Brief History of Power podcast. Pastor Koontz, welcome and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and to talk about this topic that is maybe one of the hottest ones coming up here. I guess I'd say we can talk about the temperature surrounding the topic as well as the topic itself tonight.
Cool. So I wanted to start off on a little lighthearted note.
Yeah.
So due to the Japanese heritage I share with Pastor Grills, whenever I talk to you, I have this concern about honorifics, and I always struggle going between doctor and pastor. So the American side wants to call you Dr. Koontz because that's, like American side. Lutheran side wants to call you pastor because of the office.
Yes.
And so I may flip back and forth during discussion,
No
or
worries.
one idea I have, I might fall back into my Japanese heritage and call you Koontz Sensei, which is actually satisfies my internal conflict because it covers both.
Right. There you go. Hey, whatever works for you, maybe you have a Californian side that just uses my first name. Whatever you want to do. Not a big
that
deal.
would kill me. I could not do that.
I appreciate that.
So there's like you said, there's been enough discussion online, especially concerning the issue of pastoral formation. And that led to my understanding that Dr. Mike Gibson, the president of the Pacific Southwest District, he called a Koinonia Gathering to discuss the issue. So what was the stated goal of the gathering?
Yeah, the stated goal of the gathering was really a growth in understanding, because the group was, I think, entirely by self-selection. I mean, I think everyone that was there basically wanted to be there actively. The group was roughly 2/3 in favor of some kind of expansion of online pastoral education. I mean, and that there's a very wide spectrum that maybe we should talk about kind of within that group. And then roughly 30%, 33%, somewhere close to a third of the people were more or less, again, that's on a spectrum, in favor of continuing to emphasize residential pastoral formation. And I was one of those. But the way that it was formatted really led to, I think, growth and understanding, because you had presentations like you do for any conference. Here's somebody that is in favor of this, or here's somebody that's in favor of that, or here's why from this guy's perspective, he's a parish pastor, whatever he is. But the lion's share of the time, relative to each presentation, relative to the whole day and a half, I mean, it was roughly a day and a half, all told, maybe, a full work day of gathering from noon to noon. But all told, most of your time was spent talking to other people. And then, of course, your time, your meal time and stuff like that, was spent talking to other people. Some of my time was taken visiting Red Rock Canyon National Recreation Area right outside Las Vegas. But that was just my time. That wasn't on the schedule. So, the growth and understanding part, I think, was achieved. Certainly it was for me. And I was at tables where generally I was the only person in favor mostly of residential education, and people were very chill, and it was very open, and a lot of the stuff that was brought up didn't specifically have to do with pastoral formation. And that's where I think part of the temperature on this issue is because it's a proxy for a lot of other things for anybody. It's not strictly speaking about pragmatic academic questions like how many credits should you require before someone gets through an academic program. Should pastors have to take pastoral counseling? They do now. 70 years ago, there was no such class. Those kind of pragmatic questions, like how do we do this? Like, kind of just a funny thing. I hope this is lighthearted, although it's definitely not Japanese. It's very German. It's not even American. Is that back in the day, the common way that seminary professors taught was that they lectured, and that lecture was taken down by dictation by the students. And so the students could actually sell each other generations of notes because the lecture would be the same. I mean, word for word in many cases. And there were synodical resolutions, again, back in the day, we're talking 100 years ago, 90 years ago, 80 years ago. Synodical resolutions, maybe this is interference. I don't know. But basically, like, you can't teach like that. Like, that's a terrible way to teach. You can't teach like that. I think that's probably interference in the professor's calling. I think he should be free to be extremely boring if he wants to be. Like, that's on him. But I mean, that's not really what was discussed. There was stuff about seminary specifically, pastoral formation specifically. There was also a lot of stuff about trust and differing practices and stuff like that.
So who was represented there? Was it like district presidents, faculty? Was it all parish pastors? Like, what was that mix and who was there?
The faculty, I'm not sure I saw any faculty from either seminary or like admin people or anybody from President Harrison's office that I'm aware of. It was mostly, if you're talking about who were the muckety-mucks, if you will, I think the muckety-mucks were all district presidents. And then there were other people that were there because they're unusually involved or they're unusually interested. Maybe they're on the board of directors for their district or they have a very large church or something like that. I mean, that, yes, but as far as like an official position, somehow relative to pastoral education, placement of seminary candidates, it seemed to me that it was mostly district presidents, and most of the guys on the stage were district presidents, with a couple exceptions. So,
okay,
yeah.
So as far you touched on it a little bit, but as far as what does pastoral formation mean in these discussions? Are we talking about curriculum, field work, mentorships?
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
That's a great question. Even the word formation is squishy, because everybody admits that seminary or whatever course of study you have administered by whatever medium, seminary is a part of a man's formation. That's why there's a squishy big word instead of just saying education. That he's formed by his family, his home church, the district he comes out of, the pastors he had growing up, stuff like that. Okay. What we're generally actually talking about, I would say, would be the education of prospective pastors, because we're usually not talking, this was brought up, and I thought it was a good point. Nobody's really talking about something that I personally, and it seemed like a lot of people there agreed, to me, it's kind of embarrassing that like the guy that inspects McDonald's has to do continuing education, like the guy, the county or the city health, food, like health inspector, right? Like he has to keep up on, I don't know, what are the health code violations current in our area? But the pastor, like, just goes to seminary or whatever, and then he's done. And he doesn't have to do any continuing education. So again, pastoral formation, you would hope, is going on. I certainly can say from my own experience, I have certainly learned things. In fact, I probably learned more. I mean, just in a deep kind of life experience way. I've learned plenty of things since I graduated from seminary. But generally what we're actually talking about, what the debate is actually about, is the education of prospective pastors. So we're not talking continuing education. We're not talking about all of these things the church itself really has no particular control over. They, you know, there's a 10-year-old in a congregation somewhere right now, and nobody knows the name of his pastor outside of that parish, but that 10-year-old's going to go to seminary. We're not really doing anything about his formation, strictly speaking, right now. We're actually talking about pastoral education. How do we train guys who want to be pastors and aren't yet pastors? Do we do it totally online? Do we do it residentially? That's what we're really talking about. Underneath that is usually discussion of curriculum, but honestly, curriculum wasn't extensively discussed at this gathering, at least, except by Dr. Jeff Kloha, who started the totally online Center for Missional and Pastoral Leadership, who gave a presentation. And he gave a presentation about different forms of online education and why he does what he does at Simple and stuff like that. But generally, we're not even talking about curriculum. Like, no one's really debating, does the pastor need to learn about the Lutheran confessions? It really mostly seems to be about the mode and the location of the education of prospective pastors, if I can say it that specifically.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember I was at the 2010 convention, and there was somebody who was talking about continuing education, and I know there was a whole set of pastors that freaked out because it's like, you don't trust us anymore. You don't. I was like, okay, I don't think this is going anywhere very well.
No, it's definitely going nowhere. I mean, I've seen lots of resolutions sort of to that effect, and it never goes. The idea that we would mandate or that it's being framed by anybody in terms of, oh, you don't trust me. No, it's like, well, you're human, like anybody, like the health inspector. Maybe you should keep up on things. The dentist has to do continuing education. So, but yeah, that is a separate question, but that's a total non-starter as far as I understand. I don't think it should be, but I think it is.
All right. So let's go basics, and how does pastoral formation currently work? And, kind of walk us through the standard pathways.
Okay. The standard pathway, and the phrase, if you're new to this debate, and it seems like the phrase is probably at least 6, maybe 9, maybe more years old, because the LCMS political cycle runs in triennia. So you're talking 6 years ago, maybe 9 years ago. I don't know. Maybe 10 because we were thrown off by COVID. Anyway, it's usually called gold standard at this point. Now that is a real, I thought of a French phrase and then I was like, that doesn't make any sense to humans. But that really sticks in people's craws. Gold standard. The gold standard, as that phrase is currently used, is for the residential Master of Divinity degree that you can obtain either from Concordia Seminary St. Louis or from Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne. You go, you're there for 2 years of classwork. You then move again to what's called vicarage, which is like an internship. You're in a congregation for a year under a pastor, learning more about the job. I did my vicarage in Long Island, for example. And so I was a vicar. I was never a vicar. I was a vicar. and then you move back to seminary, and that's for your quote 4th year, but really it's for your 4th 9 months, because you're going to move back at the end of the summer. And then 9 months later, you're going to move again to go to your first call. Okay. So that's the standard process today. The two seminaries used to be quite distinct because Concordia Theological Seminary, which started in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was in Springfield, Illinois for about 100 years and then moved back to Fort Wayne, Indiana about 50 years ago, I think, on the dot, was called the Practical Seminary. And it, prior, especially to the late 1960s, didn't even really give you a degree necessarily. and you didn't have a lot of educational requirements. You would show up, you would take at one time you would even take English if you needed English. So especially if you were from a non-German ethnic group, meaning you couldn't speak German, um, you had to go there. And non-German ethnic group would include people like yourself or myself who grew up speaking English, right? so, so it was really kind of a wide net. But you would go to that seminary. The curriculum was less academically rigorous. There was no knowledge of Latin. I don't think there was any knowledge of Hebrew or Greek. But you came out as a certified pastor. And so for most of the Missouri Synod's history, the seminaries were quite distinct. Everything was residential, but the seminaries were very distinct because St. Louis always had a very academically rigorous curriculum with 2 to 3 foreign languages, also English, if that's a foreign language for you growing up. So they were very different, and St. Louis was called the theoretical seminary. They've been largely the same since certainly the 1970s, and that's normal. That's been normal. In addition to that are a variety of routes, and do you want to go through the alphabet soup? I mean,
I know there's, well, obviously SMP, which we'll get into, but there's
yeah,
CMC, which I just interviewed a guy that's going through CMC,
okay,
and at my daughter's congregation in Irvine, they
okay,
have a CMC vicar, and
yes,
so, and then I know there's like an ethnic studies one, and
yes.
there's a little bit more fringy ones, but
So there are a bunch of different programs. The one that's common to both seminaries that is really in academic terms, it's what's called a hybrid program. It's not an online program because online in education means completely online. If anything is not online, if anything is in person ever, it's a hybrid program. So the two hybrid programs, the much larger one is the specific ministry pastor program. And there's a lot of debate in the Missouri Synod right now about the parameters for that. How old do you have to be to get in? What kind of situation do you have to be in your congregation or your area in order to get into that program? And the majority of those guys, I think, historically, certainly now, I know for a fact, are educated through Concordia Seminary St. Louis. There's a smaller number of guys that are educated in the SMP program through Concordia Theological Seminary Fort Wayne. CMC, Cross Cultural Ministry Center, is administered jointly by Concordia University, Irvine, California, and Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. That's a smaller number of guys that has a different curriculum if you look at it. And whereas the SMP program leads to a status on the roster of the Missouri Synod, this is what we call inside baseball on Brief History of Power. So I feel wild even being able to go into all this. But you're being very nice and just letting me talk about it. So stop me if it gets
oh,
too weird. But the SMP program leads to a roster status of being a specific ministry pastor, and there are restrictions on what those men are allowed to do within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. They can't serve in other offices, really, as circuit visitors, district presidents, stuff like that. Technically, they're not even really supposed to be in charge of their own congregation. They're supposed to have a supervisor who is a general rostered pastor. That's the other kind. Their whole ministry. So CMC, Cross Cultural Ministry Center, leads to a general roster status. So it's shorter than an MDiv. It's a hybrid program like SMP, but it leads to a general roster status. The other ones are, if I remember correctly, entirely administered by Concordia Seminary St. Louis, and there are historical reasons for that. But they generally have to do with Center for Hispanic Studies or Ethnic Immigrant Institute of Theology, which is kind of a lot of the curriculum and delivery methods that Center for Hispanic Studies uses. But whereas Center for Hispanic Studies classes are in Spanish. So if you just really can't take a class in English, your English isn't good enough, but you speak Spanish, you can do Center for Hispanic Studies. EIIT is kind of for everybody else. So I have a guy in my area, for example, who went through EIIT using American Sign Language. Okay. but a lot of the class, if you can understand English, and he can because he was born in the United States, you can do EIIT. I'm sure there's some like arcane thing, and there are acronyms for things that don't exist anymore. Like Delta and stuff like that. And we don't have to get into that unless you want to. But those are the general routes. And I guess I would say it this way: is that in the Missouri Synod, everything is either residential or it's hybrid. So even the idea that it's quote online is a little bit off, because it's, in academic terms, accrediting agencies, Department of Education would describe these programs, all of them, as hybrid. We don't have a fully online program that's authorized in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The simple thing that I mentioned earlier that Dr. Kloa and some others have put together, that's fully online. It's not authorized. Like, you can't become a pastor through Simple. So the stuff by which you can become a pastor is all either residential or hybrid in the LCMS right now.
All right. So what's working in the current system, and where are the pain points?
Yeah. What's working is that we are producing guys who are very well educated, certainly by comparison to clergy of other denominations. And Missouri Synod pastors, some of them don't, kind of get off the reservation that often. But if you do talk to, or pastors in other denominations, we receive excellent educations. Nobody's really disputing that, particularly for residential seminaries. And that is something where, if you can kind of, set aside whatever temperature you might personally have about the debate, and you talk to people who advocate for more options or more online options or something. I didn't honestly encounter anybody who said, let's get rid of the seminaries. It was kind of it was more of an advocacy of seminaries plus something else, because the pain points are they are to a small degree. The pain points have to do with larger issues of who and how is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod controlled. And maybe we can just bookmark that for discussion later, because honestly, I think a lot of this is actually about the politics of the LCMS, and incidentally, it's centering on pastoral education, but it's not about, like I said, like, it's not about pastoral education in a sense. Okay, the pain points that are specific to education would be, and I certainly understand this, is kind of twofold. One is, it is extremely hard, particularly if you are not in the Midwest or Texas, which, if you just look at the LCMS demographically, those are the places of strength, and there are historical reasons for that. It's not an accident at all. If you're not in the Midwest or Texas, so if you're in the Northeast, the Southeast, or I guess I'd say broadly the West, not even the Pacific Coast, but the West, it's very hard to get and to keep pastors in those areas. So, apart from the question of how many congregations are economically viable, even when the place is viable, it can be hard to get a pastor into the Northeast, the Southeast, or the West. So that's also why, not coincidentally, people from those regions are overrepresented in this debate, because it is a reasonable point that if someone, just the point, right? If I already own a home that I bought, I don't know how far back I'd have to go to get a $600,000 house in California, like a house for a normal person. It depends on where you live, right? But like, I could imagine living somewhere in, I don't know, Ventura County, and I bought a house for $600,000 at some point, like within living memory. And now I'm sitting on a house that's a lot more valuable. If I sell that house and I move to Indiana for 2 years, and then Vicarage for a year, and then Indiana for another 9 months, how just financially likely is it that anyone is going to get me back to Southern California? And the demographic reality is, for example, in my class from Fort Wayne, I was the only person from east of Ohio at all.
Wow.
Um, a third of the American population lives along the Eastern Seaboard, but not in my class. So it's you have an issue of uh, which is easier to see, I think, in outlying areas, that it is hard to get pastors even when um, you can make a go of it. Even it doesn't have to be financially fringy for no one to want to go there. And I mean, California has a terrible reputation when I hear pastors talking. Um, a lot of their impression might be driven just by watching news, but there's also housing prices. So that's one thing, is it's hard to get pastors in places where we need them. The other thing is something that I was honestly at this gathering, I was very happy to talk about. It was very beautiful to me that people were thinking about these things, which is, if we believe that our religion, and especially our specific confession of our religion, is the truth, then we should have a plan. We should desire to have not just pastors to staff the financially viable congregations that we have. We should also, in accordance with our doctrine of the ministry, where we think it's important for the man who preaches the gospel and administers the sacraments to be trained. It can't just kind of be like a guy who likes Jesus, right? He needs to be trained. Um, we should want there to be more LCMS churches. How do I get more people? So I would say those are the pain points, is a lack of a mission, strategy, and focus that would then, generally, if you're not planning for something, you're not going to get anybody volunteering to do it, right? So so we're not really planning for that necessarily. And then the other pain point the one that is brought up all the time in lots of venues, is we have a terrible time getting pastors to certain places. Not all those places are even coastal. I mean, I hear reports of circuits in, the Great Plains, where it's like, there's one pastor in the whole circuit. There should be like 7, 8, 10. There's one. So those are the pain points. I mean, I think we're talking about this because we don't have enough guys for a lot of the challenges that we have as a church. If you kind of pull it into one big thing. If we weren't having those challenges, if we felt like we were flourishing demographically, especially throughout the country, and not just maybe in like Midwestern suburbs or Texas suburbs, if we felt like we were doing okay throughout the country, maybe like we were in the 50s and 60s, we probably wouldn't be talking about this. Right? I think we're talking about it because the system is in some kind of crisis. Yeah.
Okay. So, kind of, what was the actual kind of range of opinions on how formation should happen? Like, were there
Yeah.
major camps, major delineation of things?
Yeah, the major camps, if you go, I mean, I think the website's probably still up at the Pacific Southwest District. I don't know. But if you went there, you'd be able to see who the speakers were. And so the major camps have had to do with opening up more online forward options, or essentially keeping things as is. So one of the advocates for residential formation said, you know, if you want to open this up, um, try to get guys into SMP. Like there's a program. There's a program where you don't have to move the guy. And I think those are the major camps, right? There are outside of what I just said, I'm sure there are plenty of people. I didn't meet any at this thing, but they have to be out there somewhere. There are plenty of people who would say, why can't we just do an online MDiv? Like completely online. Why can't we just do that? Why can't the pastor just be completely trained online? Um, there are also people who want SMP to be abolished, basically, right? Like you would stop the program, there would be no new SMP guys, and everybody would be trained residentially. But the major camps are I want more options, or I'm kind of fine with status quo. Now,
Okay.
the status quo, especially the S&P parameters, have to do with President Harrison and his, kind of his thoughts on the matter. So those parameters could be changed, but the major camps are status quo or more options. What the more options look like, honestly, is not entirely clear. And some of what was discussed, so like Tim Allman, who controversy in whose church kind of kicked off this gathering, right, was the immediate precipitating cause for this gathering. It's his district. His district president thought we need to bring people together to talk about this. Some of the stuff that he sends people into non-LCMS approved programs to do doesn't aim to make them, and they don't want to be pastors, actually. So what's a little bit confusing about a lot of this is that some of it actually seems to be about greater lay education, particularly for involved laity who would be assisting in starting a new church or something like that. So that's a little bit confusing. And I didn't know that before I went there because it's always framed as just being about how we get pastors. But the major camps are we should get more pastors by opening up online programs, or we're good with the status quo. We have enough SMP guys coming through. Okay. Those are definitely your major camps.
That greater education of laity seems a little bit odd. I know it gets thrown into this kind of,
Yeah.
but you guys are doing the lit.
Lit does that. Yeah.
And there's, like we have, CPH has plenty of books, and we have so lay education does not, I don't know what, I've seen it get thrown in, but I'm really confused every time they bring this in, because there's a particular one of Tim Allman's co-hosts. He's he went through that. He's like, he didn't want to be I'm not sure if he does or does not want to be pastor.
Sure. But he's not a pastor. I don't think.
He's not a pastor. Yes. But he's gone through all those programs, and it's like, that's great. I don't know what I'm not pushing back on any layperson that wants to go and do, even go to simple and do that. Sure. If you, and not want to be, just for your educational purposes.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's awesome. But it seems weird because it does get thrown into this somehow sometimes. But
yeah. And I mean, there are a couple different ways you could go with that. You could say, oh, they just want more education. You could also say they have a different concept of, and this is where this debate is like interconnected with so many other things that are not about seminaries or pastoral education. Because you could say, oh, you have a different understanding of the ministry, and maybe like you're going to go through this program and then you're going to do something that everyone else would recognize as preaching, but you just call it leading a discussion. I mean, like the issue here, like if the thing that came up within a half hour of just being like chill and having discussions, so everybody's like, okay, no one's going to behead anybody at this table. The thing that came up within a half hour was basically like, especially because my table, like I was the only residential kind of positive person, was we don't trust the residential people. And the residential people, I mean, I could say from personal experience, generally don't trust those people either. So in order to have discussion, like if you and I were having a discussion about we're going to go out for dinner, but I'm convinced that you're going to try to kill me like at dinner, then if you're like, oh, I love this new Mexican place, maybe we should get Mexican, I'm going to be like, no, but it has nothing to do with whether I like tacos, and so that to me is everything is so politicized, it makes it difficult to have discussions. So, and I hope that's not like a Pollyanna, like, why doesn't everybody just be nice to each other? But it's more like, why would you even bother to talk to somebody if you weren't going to try to be clear about what he wants? And that's why I'm trying to be clear. Like, I didn't hear anybody say, get rid of residential seminary. Because I hear people saying that that's what other people want a lot. But then I talk to the other people and they don't want that. So it is really important, because otherwise why don't we just stop talking to each other? Like, why would we talk to each other at all? If you're not going to have some kind of trust or let the other person say what he actually thinks and not bite his head off. And so, yeah.
So did the opinions kind of line up along the predictable LCMS fault lines, or were there kind of unusual, unusual bedfellows?
Well, I mean, it was the LCMS, so there were weird people there. That's a joke. But yeah, it was pretty predictable. It was pretty predictable. So your fault lines that would be driven by worship style, your fault lines that would be driven by probably communion practice, your fault lines that are driven to some extent by geography. And I guess maybe I'm in the LCMS. I'm a weird person. I would be one of the weird people in the sense that I certainly having lived in expensive non-LCMS heartland types of places, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that it's very hard to get people there or even to get them back, even if they're from there. So I understand that, right? I feel that. Uh, but generally it was fairly predictable. And that's also where it's like, I hope we achieved something. Um, Koinonia is or was, I don't know if it's still going exactly, but it is or was a project initiated 12 years ago, 13 years ago, a while ago by the then first vice president of the LCMS, Herb Miller, and it was like a discussion thing. And that's what this was. I mean, this was somehow part of that. I don't exactly understand. I'm not a district president, so I don't know how that works, but that's what it was. And this was quite productive because I mean, you get exposure across fault lines. It was a nationwide thing, whereas I think that the Koinonia stuff was often about divided circuits, so very local, or districts that were very different from each other. Like I think guys from the Atlantic District, which is like the metro New York City area, basically, went to Wyoming, and I think they got to like shoot guns and stuff. I don't know what they talked about, but like that was kind of the idea. This was nationwide. It was voluntary, but it was nationwide, and so that was nice. I mean, I didn't meet any other pro-residential guys from the Northeast, but I didn't expect to. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the attendees were kind of 2-to-1 ish.
Yes.
Like, and then how about the speakers? What was the mix in that?
The speakers were balanced,
Hmm.
intentionally so. So when the gathering was first being advertised, I don't recall that there were even speakers listed, but there was a balanced presentation of different aspects of the topic. The exception to that was a pastor from Las Vegas, Bob Sundquist, presented from his exhaustive knowledge of Missouri Synod convention resolutions. I mean, exhaustive, like incredible. Like I have a terrible memory compared to this guy, right?
Wow.
And but that one wasn't really pro or con anything particularly. It was just like, here's how things have changed. And if you are able to get your hands on that, I don't know if there are recordings that are public. I don't know any of that, but if you're able to get your hands on that, that one is kind of worth chewing on because it shows you how some of these things have changed over time. Particularly the idea that, like I mentioned earlier, we used to have two very distinct residential programs, and now we have two very, very similar residential programs, and then these other hybrid options. Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
So did the perspectives did they get each get a fair hearing, or were there straw men, or how did those go?
Good. Yeah. There were few straw men. I would say that it was generally very fair, but if there were faults in the presentations, I'm sure there were humans involved. If there were faults in the presentations, the thing that I most often noticed was omission. So you say something, but you don't consider something else that you could consider. there was very little of something that I noticed very often in the LCMS, and I think it's because people are just this is just kind of a social dynamics thing. I think people are often in the LCMS very, very comfortable in whatever setting they're in. An exception would be like Synod Convention, where you're in a room with thousands of people you don't generally know. But there are even people who are very comfortable there. But generally, you're in a very comfortable setting. You're at your congregational meeting. You know all these people. You've been to their houses. And there was a little bit of that where it's like, you didn't have to say it in that sort of snarky way because that didn't help anything. But mostly it was omission. Like, I'm not really considering because, and this might have had to do with the length of time each presentation really had, is that very often you were dealing with a limited amount of time to make a specific, here's why there should be more options. Um, Limited amount of time. Tim Allman got up and kind of explained what had happened at his church that had caused him to get into this kind of online education stuff. And in his case, it's fully online, and the people are not treated as pastors. But that's that's its own thing. So it was mostly by omission. And the reason that I say that is not because somebody's presentation needs to be perfect, but um, the model, the debate model creates necessarily, I mean, just in your how you structure something if you're talking, debate model creates a necessarily adversarial frame. Okay. And that's fine when you have a resolution, whether in debate or some kind of deliberative body, resolved that we make, Brian Yamabe the king of California, resolved. And then we're pro or we're con. I'm not going to take into deep account if I'm pro Brian needs to be king. I'm not taking into deep account the facets or the motivations of con. And something that we talked about at a couple different groupings that I was in was that our system of essentially like voter democracy at every level of the Missouri Synod. Voter democracy sets up a system where it becomes very hard to resolve conflict if it really matters. Because basically it's like, okay, you win this debate, you get 58% of the vote. And in an American political setting, 58% is a giant mandate. I mean, if any presidential candidate got 58% of the popular vote, he's the most popular guy since I think maybe George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush. That's a giant margin. In the church, and I think we know this on a local level, but it does honestly feel impossible on a national level or even a district level. On a local level, we kind of know we want, if we can, to make decisions by consensus. We want to, because it's better for the body to make decisions by consensus. And if that means that's part of the reason that if somebody has some big objection to something in a church meeting, we generally don't cut them off at the 2-minute mark. We let them because it's just better for the body if they're heard, and maybe they just always have to make a 5-minute speech or whatever. But then we vote, and that's the way it is. It's better if we can get close to consensus decision making rather than an up or down vote. When you have these bigger bodies, you're doing up or down vote. The gathering was structured sort of in that way, like a facet of the topic of pastoral education, pro con, or residential online, to put, and that structures everything in an adversarial form, and it's the adversarial form. And this is where I think the political ramifications of this, or the political source of the discontent comes from, because if you are in the 42% or the 40% or the 30% or whatever the percentage is, synod president election, some resolution or something, your option is to try to keep working through that system. If you feel like the system is completely uninterested in what you have to say, what are you going to do? Well, you're probably going to try to get around the system. And there was a plea specifically by President Heath Curtis from the Southern Illinois district where he said, guys, if you want to change this, like, because here you could do this. You could say, resolved, Concordia Seminary St. Louis and Concordia Theological Seminary Fort Wayne must offer a fully online Master of Divinity degree. You could do that. The seminaries are just there to do stuff that the Synod wants them to do. That's what they're there for. They're not like independent entities like Harvard University or something. They're there to do what the Synod wants them to do. So you could mandate that. He said, you will get a fair hearing. I think that was a phrase he used. I don't think it was fair play. I think it was, you will get a fair hearing. Okay. In the different venues that you have for submitting overtures and et cetera. And that phrase very obviously rankled a lot of people because they said, no, we won't. No, we won't. Now, apparently he disagreed with something that Synod teaches or does. He didn't say what the topic was, but he had gone through the same process that Pastor Allman had gone through, I guess last year, of dissenting from Synod, and but he said, I learned a lot and everything, and he said, I got a fair hearing, but there is just immense skepticism about whether that's actually possible, and that skepticism is not really an issue about pastoral education. It's not about pastors need to learn how to preach better, or the pastors need to learn to visit more or something. It's not about pastors even. It's about trust within the church. And that to me was the bigger issue. I mean, I didn't bring it and I didn't leave with it. Like, if anything, I was like, this is really nice. This is nice to talk to people. But I wasn't bringing that issue like I will never be heard. But it seemed like a lot of people were, because when he said fair hearing, they were like, nah, that's not happening.
So I'm California politics. I'm used to getting crushed on that side, and I'm also part of the CNH, which I have the same. I'm part of the 30% out here.
There you go. Okay.
I had a resolution that's an overture that said we should, like at pastoral, at official district gatherings, we should use the hymnal, and it got turned into we should use various forms of worship, and it was like,
right.
I mean, that's
right.
So like.
Right.
I know what they're saying. That's how they feel, and that's
yes.
how I feel all the time out
yes.
here. But I don't know. I can empathize with them, but then I'm not. Nothing's going to happen out here.
Yes, right. And so that's where to me it's kind of like, it's like when you realize that our congregational polity is obviously built to maximize local autonomy. No Missouri Synod parish has to worry that they're just going to be shut down by the district. I mean, maybe the district is telling you that. Don't listen to them. Like, that's not legally true. Probably, depending on what it says in your Constitution. Read your Constitution. But we're obviously set up to maximize local autonomy. We're not set up to maximize efficient use of resources. We're not. There's no clause that says when you get to the point where you have like 10 people and you're barely keeping the lights on, you have to close and you must consolidate with the nearest local Missouri Synod church. Nobody has to do that. We're obviously maximizing local autonomy. In the same way, our polity is obviously set up to give some sense of representation, certainly on the district level, because every congregation has representation. But even the circuit delegates who go to Synod Convention, to give local representation to everybody. And sometimes people say that system is senatorial, meaning like there are 2 senators from Rhode Island and there are 2 senators from California. That's true in the district. That's not exactly true in the Synod Convention, because if you have more people, meaning you have more circuits, you have more congregations and or more people in those congregations, you have more representation. So the Michigan district has way more people at a synod convention than the New Jersey district. Okay. So we have kind of a mix of a senatorial and a House of Representatives form of representation, right, at the different levels. But all of it is about voting. So the system is optimized for representation of opinion, of current opinion, okay? It's not optimized for a whole lot else. And that's one of the things that Pastor Sundquist, that's one of the points he made was you could, if you know enough about the history of these resolutions, you're going to think the Missouri Synod has multiple personality disorder. Because in 1989, they're like, well, you don't have to be a pastor to administer communion and preach. You could be, I don't know, let's call it a licensed lay deacon. And then we kind of have that sort of still in some places. We had it a lot more of it, 20 years ago. But we also were like, we really believe that you have to be rightly called according to Augsburg Confession 14 in order to be a pastor. It's much better to think of it as this is what the opinion was of the body assembled in 1989 or 1992 or 2010. So we're optimized for that. Like, there's going to be a convention in the summer, and we're going to know what the kinds of people who care enough about the LCMS to be convention delegates think. We're going to know what they think. Like, the majority of them always support the idea, at least, of closed communion. Always. But there's always, in the national convention, 20 to 30% that don't. Always. That doesn't mean closed communion is right or wrong. It just means that's what people think. The system is not really built for how do I handle enduring conflict that honestly is not even, sometimes it's not even necessarily theological. There's theological conflict. There's also sort of perspective conflict. Like, you simply see the world differently when you are one Missouri Synod Lutheran and you live on a cul-de-sac that has Buddhists and Hindus and evangelicals in Southern California than if there's a Catholic church and a Lutheran church in your town. And then there's a country church that's obviously LCMS because the Catholics closed their country church a long time ago. So there's a combination of theological disagreement that it is kind of hard to get to when you're just talking about procedural stuff. So, and that's where the trust thing comes in. If we're just debating, like, how do we get pastors, we're not even talking about what those pastors are going to do once they're ordained. Like, are they going to do open communion? Are they going to use a hymnal? We're not even talking about that at this point. We're just talking about how we get pastors. And then there's also perspectival conflict. I think built by the fact we're a national church, that's going to be there. Like, the theological conflict, sure, that's a problem. Perspectival conflict, that's people. People have completely different lives. And if we're actually carrying out the proclamation of the gospel throughout the United States of America, in the case of our church body, that's going to happen. That's okay. That's fine. Yeah.
So going back to more the pastoral formation stuff, what's the strongest case for the online/hybrid of mechanism?
Yeah. I think the strongest case is that it enables you to create more of whatever you're trying to graduate faster. And there were examples brought up at the gathering of other very human-focused professions. So not like you just crank out like a computer science degree in the fastest possible time, totally online. Human-focused things that have required apprenticeships, hundreds of hours of supervised work, stuff like that. Like, basically, like, if you can do this with nursing, if you can do this with counseling, if you can do this with behavioral therapy, you can do this with something else that involves interacting with human beings. So that, while you are taking academically complex classes, the educational precedent exists in spades. I think that's the strongest possible case. The question, we haven't really talked about seminary trends generally. Maybe if you would let me do that in a little bit. Uh, the strongest possible case for the residential formation is we know it actually produces Lutheran pastors. Whereas other educational models are untried. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of where fresh education models maybe don't actually produce what you think they're going to produce. That old theoretical practical seminary distinction produced Missouri Synod pastors who came by the theoretical route, who essentially went away to boarding school when they were in the equivalent of what in an American educational system would be 7th or 8th grade. The Missouri Synod retained a German educational system, not just the language, but like the structure forever. I mean, a very long time. Those guys knew each other deeply. That had knock-on effects in how the church body functioned that nobody's even aware of anymore because it's been gone, essentially since the battle for the Bible in the early 1970s, when that system was really obliterated by the controversy those institutions had involved themselves in. So we still have residential formation, but it is not nearly as deep or extensive as it used to be. And we don't even really understand that or realize that, because now it's like, oh, you went to Fort Wayne, I went to St. Louis. Back in the day, if you, quote, went to St. Louis, you went through life from essentially 12 or 13 with these guys, and then you were in the same profession your entire life with them. That's huge. And that's not even about curriculum. The curriculum was different, but it's not even about curriculum. So when you make a modality change, so now we say you can get a bachelor's in whatever you want. You have to have a bachelor's to get into residential formation. It's not necessarily the case with a lot of the hybrid programs, but residential you do. You can get a bachelor's in anything you want. You can get a bachelor's in chemical engineering. It has nothing to do with ancient languages or history or anything. We used to say, if you don't know ancient Greek and Roman history, you can't be a pastor. Because we even taught the guys at the practical seminary that stuff. Because it does kind of apply to the New Testament in the early church. But anyway, that would be a personal hobby horse I would like to ride. But when you change not just the curriculum, but sort of the life scope, you change who the pastors are. And things do become rockier when you don't know each other that deeply, which is the case for all of us today. And wasn't the case for the vast majority of us 70 years ago. So that's where, once you change modality, you have to make sure that you're not losing a lot of other things that you're not even thinking about. Because I don't remember anybody bringing that up explicitly in any public debate in the battle for when we were getting rid of that system. I don't remember anybody bringing that up. I think they kind of took it for granted. Like, oh, it'll be like it will. But when this trust thing comes up, it does matter that we don't really know each other on a human level. Like, that does matter. Without some kind of impartial standard, it all just feels like judgment calls, or my side's not winning or your side's winning or whatever the case may be. So that's that. When you change modality, you're changing things you don't even know you're changing, in addition to all the stuff you're aware you're changing. Yeah.
So did anyone argue that the distributed model would produce better pastors in some way, like more connected to parish realities or equipped for diverse contexts, or
that's good. That's a great question. Not explicitly. Not explicitly. And this is where the omission thing comes in, is that implicitly it was argued that, these guys will kind of be more in touch with life, not being, 24-year-old guys who have only ever gone to school. There's a fair point, and the fair point here is we, throughout the Missouri Synod, debate the pros and the cons, and you're going to weight that depending on what you want. The pros and the cons of online education. Fair point is we rarely discuss the cons of residential formation. And having done it and having taught at a seminary, I'm personally well aware of the cons. So I'm happy to discuss that, but that is a fair point. But that was really only brought up implicitly. Or they just said, like, we don't often talk about what would be the matter with residential guys, which is, yes, you're 24, you've only ever been in school, you go on vicarage, you don't really know how to relate to normal people because all day, every day, you talk to other people about theology. That's not what normal people do. But how do you do that? And it takes time for a man to figure that out. That's going to be a little bit easier if you're 45 and you live there and you're already in the congregation. So the slights, if there were slights, I would say were almost entirely implicit. People were trying to be, this was visible on both sides, trying to be as fair as possible. When they weren't being fair, it was generally only implicitly. And what was implicitly clear, or what was clear from implicit mention of, yes, they will be better prepared for diverse contexts and stuff, is how am I going to get a residential guy to do this? And I would say this is that that discussion would have a different shape if we had tons of guys rolling out of both seminaries every year. Because we don't, the just brutal reality is the guy has honestly more choice than he's ever had before. That's even to some degree true for a seminary graduate, back in the day, there are guys who said, I asked to go to California, so they sent me to Alabama. You know what I mean? Like, or vice versa. Like I said, like, I never want to be inside the state of California, so they sent me to California. Like, that was almost like the modus operandi at times, because we could afford to just say, you're going to do this. This is where you're going to go. No choice, no discussion. Go. Today it's like, well, where do you want to go? Because we don't want the guy to wash out because we don't have that many guys. So if he says, look, I would prefer, like, I grew up in a suburb of Milwaukee, I'd like to be in a suburb of a Midwestern city within 2 to 3 hours of my in-laws. We can do that. There's plenty of churches like that need a pastor. It's even more true when you're calling from the field. That guy can go anywhere he wants. So I think though some of the, like I said, if that weren't in crisis, we probably wouldn't be talking about a lot of this. I certainly think we wouldn't be saying we need more guys because we need a guy who already lives in Cupertino and speaks Mandarin, because we're never going to get a guy to move to Cupertino and speak Mandarin. Back in the day, we would just buy a house in Cupertino for him, and we'd be like, you have to learn Mandarin now. Like, we just did that. People just had to do, like, kind of wild things. People who were almost entirely ethnically German and some of whom didn't even grow up speaking English, we'd just be like, go do this. I think if we had tons of guys, we'd probably still be saying things like that a lot more. But now it's like, I don't know where this guy's going to come from. So if I have a guy who already lives there and whatever, knows Mandarin or whatever, a lot of people default to that.
So you mentioned that the change in modality and the problems that might or would probably come along that we don't even know about. But
yeah.
So what is the strongest case against the distributed model?
Yeah. Strongest case against distributed would not just be the suspicion of, because I'd have to sit there and think for hours about different ramifications, and this is where I would love to use history. One of them is that there are already church bodies that have highly distributed pastoral formation networks, and a good example is the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. They don't even really have a roster exactly. The local congregation accepts, calls, makes pastors sort of by whatever form you want, but they do also have a large, well, honestly, very well-funded seminary system. So they're a lot like us, but they create pastors in a very different way, much more distributed. Okay. And what I see in a highly distributed formational ecosystem is highly divergent theology. Because especially if I open it way up, I have little to no control. And so here's the issue, right? Something that was brought up at the gathering, just as a suggestion, I heard a couple different people mention, was, can't we just, like, in order to ensure that the guy is actually like an Orthodox Lutheran pastor, can we not just have pastors interview him in the same way that you have pastors and sometimes laity interview candidates for residential formation and I think the different hybrid programs as they go into those programs? I had to do an in-person interview. I drove 8 hours because I was at one corner of the Eastern District and I drove to where the headquarters was. To do an in-person interview that took like an hour. So, um, we do that. Can we not just do that when the guy finishes whatever course of education he's getting? Um, the the difficulty there is, I think, in our polity, because polity-wise, we are a lot more like Southern Baptists than we are like Presbyterians. Presbyterians require you, whatever your formation was, to pass an extremely rigorous exam before your local presbytery. So the local pastors, as well as ruling elders in their case, are responsible for ensuring your orthodoxy. It's hard to see that would actually occur in the Missouri Synod because we're already set up to be Congregationalists, like the Southern Baptist Convention. So we would have to have a lot of mechanisms to ensure that we were actually okay and we weren't getting massive theological divergence. And it's very hard for me to see it playing out that way, because it seems to me that in the Missouri Synod, and I don't know really how you get around this with our polity, if a congregation can get away with doing what it wants to do, that's what it does. And I'm not even saying get away like they're being naughty, just like they do some weird thing and they think it's normal because they do it, and they can do it because the local congregation can do whatever it wants in many ways. So it's hard for me to see that we're not going to replicate that. We're going to do whatever we want if we opened up and widely distributed education, similar to how Southern Baptist Convention has residential seminary, but you don't have to go there. You don't even have to go to seminary necessarily. You just have to be called.
All right. So this came from a discussion I had with my professor son-in-law. But on the flip side, did anyone raise the concern about what this is his term, but I guess it's common, it's academic inbreeding in the distributed model? So particularly if a congregation, like if they're forming their own pastors in place, and then
Sure.
they have several generations of these pastors in place, like won't this create some theological ecosystem that's kind of like, that's more insular than like the residential programs could ever produce?
Yeah, that was definitely brought up.
Okay.
And I would say that was definitely brought up by the advocates of residential formation. And it's brought up frequently enough that there were rejoinders in multiple pro-online discussions to it, even without anyone bringing it up beforehand to that speaker. The rejoinder was generally, no one's envisioning purely inter-congregational formation in the way that, for example, to pick a famous American pastor, Doug Wilson basically just started his own college and seminary in Idaho. He was raised Baptist. So that I totally get that. The thing that so they're basically like, no, there's going to be a faculty, like wherever you go, there's going to be a faculty. You're going to hear from different people. You're going to meet different people. All of this is super theoretical right now because there is no actual opening up of any hybrid program beyond where it currently is. So theoretically, you could structure things in a lot of different ways. Inbreeding is already a problem for us, like just only talking to each other. So even with the even with the faculties we have, so I think that could possibly get worse. The thing that I'm wary of is like, if I just look at this historically, like it seems like the Missouri Synod is so disturbed by the existence of conflict. We rarely discuss all of the potential pitfalls of something before we adopt it. We just kind of adopt it by majority vote, and then we run with it, and then it gets like severely tweaked, maybe out of existence over time. Like that seems to be how we deal with things, right? Okay, so prove me wrong, but like that seems to be how we deal with things. Like our whole structure of how Synod Inc. works was advocated by a man who lost an election and then has been administered by a man who didn't want it, who won that same election, right? So like that's obviously getting tweaked because he wasn't necessarily in favor of the thing that he inherited, how it now works, because they voted for one guy's program and elected the other guy. So it's just like a mess, right? So if it's going to be and I think it's like that because like I said, everything is voter democracy. And voters don't necessarily like know what they want in some kind of like coherent way on every topic. How could they? Like nobody's an expert on everything. So that's what we get, right? So okay, now we're going to do a different modality. You're going to open it up and you're like, "Well, we're not going to have like theological weirdness because we're going to put all these checks and balances in place." Like it's everything so quickly becomes a Rube Goldberg machine with us. And I'm really wary of that. And when it's not a Rube Goldberg machine, it seems like we have another tendency to just do whatever we want. And like locally, And and that will obviously just create more conflict because somebody's going to do something really weird. Like, just wait for it. Like, it's going to open up, right? I'll just give you like a counterexample. It's going to open up and you think it's opening up and it's just like guys who have like big contemporary worship centered churches. No, some weird guy is going to open it up and he's going to like wear a cassock all the time and train people to be, sort of like Eastern Orthodox deacons and teach them that he's like the divinely instituted bishop of that place, like a theology of the ministry we don't have. So you don't know what you're going to open up. That's I'm not wary of, I like change generally for myself personally, but like in the Missouri Synod, change usually just means extra chaos. That's just a historical observation. So that's, yeah.
Excellent. That convention, I was at that 2010 one, and that was the weirdest thing, like having President Harrison elected when it was like he had railed against all this structure. Yes. And he was voted, and then all the structure got put in place, and it's like why are you doing? I don't understand this. I don't know.
It's like it's like you elect Donald Trump, but then you're like, and America will never use a tariff on any other country again. Yeah. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like what? But that's what we do. That's what we do. So if you know that's the reality of polity is like boring and irrelevant until it's not, and and our polity often decides not necessarily what should happen, but it certainly decides what does happen. And because of the nature of our polity, like people are in and out, people are running for office. A guy that was a delegate 10 times is now dead, and he's been replaced by a guy who doesn't even know how to use the voting machine. Like, these are just the on the ground realities. You don't know really what's going to happen within certain parameters. So that's where it's like, okay, we can try to invent something new, but if it's not completely clear and has not really achieved any kind of broad consensus in the church, when it gets adopted, just wait for it to be another Pandora's box, in ways that, like I said, are completely unpredictable. It's not just going to be, my fellow golf shirt enjoyers, who are doing weird pastoral education things if you open that up, right?
So, for all my disagreements with Dr. Kieschnick, I will say that at that convention, when he ran the chair for the rest of that convention, he
Yeah.
did it with such grace. I can't imagine after he had been just shocked that he wasn't put in
Yes.
charge of this thing but
Yes.
he just ran the convention, and it was like, it was
Yeah.
pretty grace. Oh, man.
Yeah, I love to see a firm adherence to Robert's Rules of Order. I mean, it kind of warms my heart.
So going back to the SMP program,
Yeah.
and so my understanding has always been, and every time it gets mixed, but it's designed. My understanding is it's designed for men to go into underserved areas, where pulling them out of the congregation
Yeah.
would be, a detrimental to whatever mission or congregation he's serving.
Right.
But then that's my understanding. But then I always hear bizarre ones, like in the Michigan district, they have 3 SMPs and 2 of them were like the teachers at the thing, and they just needed associates or something. And so,
Okay.
yeah, how, like at the gathering, what, like was there this advocacy for just opening up SMP to pretty much anybody, like making it into a larger, just another option?
Yeah. There was obviously there was the stuff that was discussed was not the full scope of the issue in any way. Like, and I was a little surprised that we didn't talk more about SMP specifically, but I think people are kind of thinking bigger than that, to be honest with you. I think they're kind of thinking like, why can't we have a hybrid option that makes you a general pastor, similar to Cross Cultural Ministry Center? But that has its own kind of parameters and limitations, on kind of what situations can get in. So, um, so it wasn't really specifically about SMP, other than the newly announced floor of 40 years of age to enter the SMP program. The stuff that was brought up relative to SMP was mainly about age. It was also partly about limitation on creation of staff pastors for large churches, which has been, I don't know percentages, but has been a much larger use of the SMP program in pastoral training than I think anyone envisioned when SMP was instituted. And SMP was instituted as a program to close up various other programs, but the big one was distance education leading to ordination, DELTO. But it was also, again, here's a key Missouri Synod word, implicitly, to end the practice of having licensed lay deacons who were not pastors, but did all the pastor stuff. They'll go through SMP and they will become pastors. So that's what SMP seems to have been for. It has also become a way for large churches. And I have to say, large churches in the Missouri Synod are living in a administrative reality that almost nobody else in the Missouri Synod is. And the way that churches their size are generally run in the United States is with large paid staffs. And the guys who are becoming SMP pastors are still on staffs that, if you compare them to the local non-denom or Baptist church, are still a lot smaller, often, those staffs. But the guys are called pastors, and they feel like he needs enough training to work here full time because he's a man and he could help in these ways and he could preach. And that's what they've used SMP for. And I think that is being tightened up. That was definitely brought up. Is basically like, no one's even listening to what we need for what our church does. Okay. That was brought up. The age thing was brought up. The rest of it really was not, because it was the online speakers as well as the advocates in their seats were almost like blue sky thinking in some ways. Like, how would we build this out if we could? Yeah. Because they don't have to defend a status quo, you know. I guess, so they can kind of like think more along, what they want to do. And I think that some of that is also tied to training church planters, for which the Missouri Synod doesn't seem to actually have a mechanism anymore. It used to be outsourced to what's called a recognized service organization. I don't know if your listeners know what that is, but it's like an
Probably.
agency. Yeah, they probably do. It used to be outsourced to an RSO, but that RSO, I think it was an RSO. Anyway, it was an agency. It was LCMS people. That RSO doesn't exist anymore. So they're just trying to do a variety of things, and they think hybrid education will work better for it. SMP seems to be one option among others in that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I heard there was talk of, like, pretty much everyone agrees that the formation needs to be outcome based, right? That's the word that I heard. So what are we what are we aiming for when we talk about outcomes in pastoral formation?
That's a good question. And I didn't, and this is probably just me, but I didn't see we didn't discuss that specifically, that maybe other people did. We didn't discuss that specifically in any group I was in. In the time allotted. I believe that there are disagreements over what those outcomes are supposed to be. And the reason I believe that is because my observation would be that jokes about the differences between graduates of the respective seminaries are generally jokes about outcomes. And how can you tell a Fort Wayne guy, right? While he's showering in his chasuble, their differences about their behavioral differences, their personal differences, their interpersonal differences, right? Fort Wayne guys can't make eye contact. I'm picking on my own, my own tribe in this way. But that sometimes I would say this, because of whatever set of personal mannerisms I have or something, people who don't know differently believe that I went to St. Louis. So there's an outcome thing here that has to do with what kind of a man is that pastor. And I have a good question in the hopper for Brief History of Power that I'm going to answer about that question, submitted by a loyal listener, because that is a very valid thing, and that doesn't have to do with whether he wears golf shirts every day or a collar every day. They kind of have to do with, how does he relate to human beings? What is he doing? Is it difficult to be in a room with him because he's just such an awkward person, or he's like hard to listen to, or whatever? Those are all valid questions, and they are not things that we're especially talking about. By the same token, something that I didn't hear many people talking about. I'll just give you an example from present programs. The SMP program covers roughly 40% of the curriculum of the residential MDiv program. That's a fairly low percentage. So if you're talking about curriculum, what kind of outcomes do we want? Well, I think it's very important that the pastors have knowledge of the original biblical languages, because we believe that the scriptures are verbally inspired. But we're not talking about the New International Version or the English Standard Version. We're talking about the original languages. And so he needs the ability to unfold those scriptures for God's people from the original. He needs that ability. We have maintained that in pastoral education in the Lutheran Church since the Reformation. It's going to be a lot harder to deliver that kind of capability in a hybrid or online format. And I know that because I took online Greek before going to seminary. I couldn't do what's probably most common, which is summer Greek. The summer before you start MDiv classes, you move and you take summer Greek. Couldn't do that because my child was born in June, so he didn't want to go to summer Greek, so I didn't go to summer Greek. And I had Hebrew but not Greek in undergrad, so I took Greek online. That is an option. You can do that. I took Greek online, and it was so hard. Now, I love Greek, and I am good at Greek now, but it was terrible. It was so hard to learn a language just on the internet. So, um, these we didn't really talk enough about outcomes that I heard, or other discussions might have done that. I didn't hear it from the dais, and I didn't hear it in the groups I was talking in. And I think that if we started to talk very honestly about what those outcomes need to be, like, here's an outcome we don't talk about, I wish we had. I want us to go back to expecting pastors to look at people when they're preaching. I think that's so important. I think that is extremely important to human communication. But we don't really expect it out of seminary graduates anymore. So if you can talk about outcomes, then I think you have a clearer picture of what you're shooting for, and then you can build out from there. And I think the discussion of pastoral education is usually most fruitful when you start by talking about outcomes, and then you move into a discussion of how do I get to that outcome. And that, not coincidentally, that's usually how traditional pastoral theologies start. Overall view of what kind of man he's supposed to be, 1 Timothy 3 kind of stuff, Titus 1 kind of stuff. And then you go into this is how you do a baptism, this is how you preach, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So from the pro-hybrid side, could you implicitly kind of gather what they were looking for as far as outcomes for a pastor would be?
I think the outcomes were probably more focused than, coming from residential circles, they were probably more focused on interpersonal skills and also on evangelism than residential discussions usually are. Okay. And I'm being careful in my language because I don't want to be unfair to kind of my own, as it were, camp. But usually when my social circles get together, we are not talking except by way of joking about the need for excellent interpersonal skills. We're talking about, what did Martin Chemnitz say? And so it seemed like there's much more of an emphasis on those skills, which are not, and I think if you just think about it kind of clearly in a categorical way, those are extremely difficult to create in somebody where they're not already there, and classrooms are not designed to create them in anybody. It's a reason that within the residential program, a lot of guys grow absolutely enormously as human beings into the kind of pastors they're going to be on vicarage. They have field work in their first 2 years. They're at a church every Sunday, the same church. They don't pick it, they get assigned. But vicarage, day in and day out, they're doing the work. That's when they grow the most. Maybe in interpersonal skills, but also just like kind of, how am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do? There's much more of an emphasis on that coming from the pro-hybrid side or pro-online side, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, no question. And I can certainly recognize that as a deficit that especially younger residential formation guys often have. Like that's the part they grow the most in their first couple years of ministry, no question. They have read Martin Chemnitz. They have to grow in how they relate to people.
So they should win friends and influence people or something.
Yeah, I think that if we're talking about outcomes, there is a part of the outcome that is becoming a pastor is a reshaping of you. Wilhelm Leah, I don't believe this is in his pastoral theology. I think it's in a letter. But he talks about how he believes that God made him a pastor so that he would remain a Christian, that you are put into a calling that is similar to being a father, similar to being a daughter. It is generally lifelong. It is very hard. It is personal. It's not a job in that normal sense. Um, Although if people spend their entire career doing something, I think they kind of they understand the same thing. You know, if I retire and I'm not doing this every day, who am I? Um, that it has to change you completely, or you're not really picking up on what's happening here. So when you think about it that way, the role of interpersonal skills, communication skills, etc., is for the sake of the teaching. That's why it's impossible to separate the personal change from the academic change. You need to know things and you need to know how to communicate them. I mean, the qualification is not apt to read. It's not apt to like theology videos on YouTube. It is apt to teach. So you need to know things and you need to know how to communicate them. And that kind of occupies the entire person. So there is a reality that the faster that not only you have something to communicate, but also that you have a love for human beings, for example, um, per se, that that comes through in your communication, and honestly does make it more meaningful to the people listening to you, because it's not a dry lecture. You actually believe this stuff and you love them so much you're communicating it to them. That's all part of it. That's all part of it. So I can't really separate the academic from the personal in that way. Like I study in order to communicate, and I communicate so that I can study more. And do it better, say it more clearly. So yeah, they're not separable. I think that there's definitely more of a focus, obviously historically, in residential programs on academic preparation, because that's what they're for. You know, I mean, if you are a if you are a completely deranged human being, 4 years of seminary is not going to solve that. Right? Like, necessarily. Hopefully they'll figure that out and you won't do all 4 years and be ordained. But a class time is not designed to solve that. Yeah.
So, one pro online advocate, I would say, one of his critiques was that he was worried that the residential path is forming a particular type of pastor, and that the synod wants only a particular type of pastor.
Yeah.
Was that brought up? And I
Yep.
don't know what these types of pastors are. That I think we only have one type, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand what that
Yeah.
type thing
Yeah.
was.
Yep. I heard that almost verbatim.
Okay.
Um, I think that has largely to do with worship. I think. Okay. Type of pastor, yeah, I mean, there's always going to be guys who are shy. There are going to be guys who can't get enough of crowds. I mean, that's going to vary. I think that objection is largely about worship, and that now, with both seminary chapels using the Lutheran service book, um, basically exclusively. Lutheran hymnals in the pews at St. Louis, but I've never pulled it out when I was in chapel there. There's also Spanish Bibles. I have pulled those out, but Lutheran service book used at both chapels. That essentially worship style is identical in the training from both residential seminaries. And that's not training you to lead a church that uses contemporary worship. This is, again, where I come back not just to the question of trust, but to the question of polity. We're optimized for local autonomy. The Synod Constitution talks about doctrinally pure, what is it? School books, textbooks, and hymnals.
Yeah, I forget.
Hymnals,
Yeah.
doctrinally pure. I remember that phrase. I'm failing. My canon law knowledge is lacking. But doctrinally pure hymn books, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't tell you which ones. And we don't have what Lutherans certainly historically had. I mean, some Lutherans in the United States have had something like this, the Buffalo Synod. We don't need to chase this rabbit trail, but if the listeners are interested, the Buffalo Synod had something like this. And certainly the Lutherans in Europe generally had this, which is what's called a church order. I think you can buy Martin Chemnitz's church order from CPH. So that's one that's in English you can access. And the church order lays out some of the stuff that's in what's called the agenda, which is like all the stuff the pastor does generally himself, like a committal service, a burial, a wedding. What do you do? How do you administer communion? Stuff like that. It lays out agenda type of stuff, but it also lays out, this is how you're going to do things. You're going to use this hymnal. You're going to use this form of service for a funeral. And that's just what everybody does. That's what you do. We don't have that. We've never had that. We had it, and this is what makes it, I think, especially difficult when we're talking about worship. We had it within living memory. There was a time when everyone in the Missouri Synod essentially used the Lutheran hymnal. That's gone, but it did exist. But that was not like required, because it couldn't be. So we have a situation where it's like, okay, one type of pastor is being created. I think that's largely about worship. I think that's about the kind of congregation that is being served by the pastor. Okay. What else can I do? I mean, I kind of have two forces coming at each other that don't have to get along. One is how the seminaries teach men to conduct worship. The other is how a given local congregation wants to conduct worship. They don't have to agree with each other, not in our polity. So that's where it's kind of like difficult to see how this situation could resolve itself.
So, one of the other advocacy points was that where the comes from the multi-site congregations, and the seminaries just don't have, they're not equipping pastors for the multi-site ministries. I know this is going to be a little bit of a rabbit trail, but like, how does this multi-site thing fit into our Lutheran, ecclesiological model, ecclesiastical model? I don't understand it. And so,
yeah. Okay. Multi-site, is structured a couple different ways, both inside and outside the LCMS. So, you would kind of have to know on a case-by-case basis, is it a situation where those are effectively the same thing as if I have a worship service going in, like in the case of my congregation, I could have a worship service in my sanctuary, and I could have a worship service going on at the exact same time, roughly 3 miles south of here in my school gym. Okay. Those are both worship services of Redeemer Lutheran Church. We have multi-site ministries that are, but they just like have a campus pastor, often SMP trained, a campus pastor, and kind of different branding and labeling, a different website, et cetera, for what's happening in the school gym 3 miles away. You could have that. That is ecclesiologically not a separate congregation. So in that case, I mean, if they're saying like, well, how do I get multi-site guys? What they're really asking is, how do I build out the footprint of my congregation on any given weekend? And it's just my congregation. We also have structures in other places. And again, a lot of this is taken, and this is where, for your listeners, I would say, Lutherans, please become more aware of what other Christians in the United States are doing, because that's generally where this stuff comes from. So you don't have to just be like shocked that it's occurring. It's occurring because people are aware of other things outside of the Missouri Synod. The other way that this often works is that the multi-site is, and this is, I think, less common in the LCMS, but that the multi-site is sort of like a set of organizations with a main church and its senior pastor, as sort of the overseer of a variety of more or less self-supporting or self-governing entities, almost like a local circuit, but just overseen with called pastors at different places, but just overseen by one guy at a central location. That's less common in the LCMS because that's really hard to substantiate. Like, if you are your own congregation in the LCMS, even if you're financially dependent on somebody else, you can call. Like, you can do your own thing. So usually they're not going to charter those sites as congregations, because in the LCMS, you're immediately independent. Again, we're optimized for local autonomy. Like, so if you're going to do multi-site in the LCMS, you kind of have to keep it branded as your church. And what they'll often do is they'll say, Redeemer Oakmont, or Redeemer, where my school is, would be Verona or Penn Hills. But those aren't really actually separate congregations, because as soon as they are in the LCMS, they can kind of do whatever they want. And that defeats the purpose of multi-site, which involves efficiency. Multi-site is a creation of the heavily corporate culture influenced American evangelical landscape, which, say whatever else you will, they're being more efficient with their resources usually than we are. And that's what multi-site is for. Because they're like, well, we have a lot of money and people over here, so we're going to use it to do something over here that you can't do over here by yourself. That's what it's for. So in order to pull that off in the LCMS, usually you have to keep it. And so you'll see, like, if you went to their church website, all of they would have like 6 pastors rostered. Those guys only see each other once a week because they're here and there and this other place, and 3 are at the main campus. That's usually how they can do it. Multi-site in the LCMS is almost always involve a contemporary worship. Like, all those sites are doing contemporary worship, more or less. So again, I really think this is about worship. I don't think it's about pastors' personalities or whether they do their hospital visits faithfully or something. I think it's about worship style. And again, like I said, I'm not really sure how to resolve that within the polity of the LCMS, because you don't have to. You don't have to. I don't know. Somebody can come in and disagree with me, I know what a lot of those arguments would be. It's just hard for me to see how, polity-wise in the LCMS, you can come in and say, you have to do this one, because we don't do that. Like, I'm free to use TLH. I'm free to use, so that's, yeah.
So one day I'd like to talk to you, not tonight, but someday, about at what point in the size of a congregation should you split? Because it seems like there is some, looking at, say, Christ Greenfield, they talk about like 2,500 people, and they have like 5 pastors, but and that just seems like, how can you give pastoral care to 500? I do want to talk to them sometime about how, like, where, how are you getting notified when someone's sick? Are you doing hospital? How does that work in that side? And even some are, even the traditional ones, because my pastor was in Detroit, and so they had traditional, and at some scale they were, if you knew the pastor, you were famous for knowing the pastor, because you didn't even know who you were. And so there still seems like some number that, or some, as a church planter, what size should we be splitting at, and that kind of thing. But
that's right. Yeah. No, I would love to have that discussion. I would love to ask guys at very large churches what they are just doing, nuts and bolts wise, because in the past there were Missouri Synod churches with 600 people on a single Sunday with like 1 pastor. And that had nothing to do with worship style. That was everybody's in a cassock and surplice doing TLH. Doesn't matter where you are. California, Wisconsin, Florida, we're all doing the same thing. Basically we were. So how do you do that? I don't really know, because the model of, quote, being a pastor that is generally available in the United States mostly has to do with 2 different things, one of which is very old, one of which is, and I think could use more emphasis among us, one of which is much newer. The thing that's very old is you are the preacher. You are the preacher. And I think that could usually use more emphasis among Lutherans today. There's a lot of nonsense I have on the internet on that topic. You're the preacher. Obviously, you can preach to as many people as you want to. Like, the more the merrier. You're the preacher. The other thing that doesn't have as much emphasis among us, and it's partly because it runs against our certainly historic and present day model of pastoral education, is that you are sort of like the chief executive officer of the church. And the church is a corporation oriented towards what is again called generally in American religious culture, the Great Commission, the achievement of the Great Commission. But you're not necessarily doing all of that. And the more that you outsource, the better, because you're a good CEO. You understand your job is essentially like public accountability and making decisions, and other people carry out that work. So the more people you have, obviously, the better you're going to do with that, right? Like, so you want more people, and you're not necessarily visiting, and that doesn't have to do with like, is that guy like, oh, he just doesn't care about people, that's why he doesn't want to do hospital visits. No, he doesn't see it as his job to do everything that occurs in a church. The scale of Lutheran ministry has generally been smaller than that. And even back in the day, if the guy had 400 people on a Sunday, he still saw it as his job to do all the hospital visits. He did all the homebound visits. Because Lutheran ministry, the practice of the ministry, is tied not just to preaching to as many people as possible, it is tied to a concept of membership and accountability for membership, which is the basis for the practice of closed communion. And American religious culture just generally doesn't think about the ministry that way. It doesn't really have a membership model. It has an attendance model, which is easily measurable and doesn't involve the specific minister's responsibility for specific souls. The Lutherans have historically said the minister must give an account for the souls in his charge. We have a concept of membership. You check in on members. You talk about delinquent members. We have such a concept of membership. I don't know if we realize this is a little bit unusual. When we don't have a pastor, we describe the congregation as vacant, because we believe that we need to have somebody to care for and to increase and to preach to, but also to care for and to know the members. So we have a different theology of the ministry than most American Christians, and that has historically driven just to put it in kind of retail terms, the boutique size or the artisanal size of Lutheran congregations. We are not theologically set up to be big box. We're not. So yeah, if you go to a church and you're like that's why I want to know, like, what do you do? Like, how do you do this? Like, how do you visit the members? Who are the members? How do I know I'm not a member anymore? All that kind of stuff. Because in the case of my congregation, you would know you're a member and you would know me. And I would be super suspicious if somebody was like, oh yeah, I'm a member of Redeemer Oakmont. And they were like, who's the pastor? I'm like, who's the pastor? And they're like, I don't really know his name. That's not really possible. Sorry. If you don't know my name, you're not a member. If, just like 10 years ago, if you didn't know that guy's name, you weren't a member. So our theology of ministry governs size considerations like this. If you're a church planner, you want to say, well, it's when I have enough people to have a self-supporting congregation. That's a size consideration. But that's going to happen way before I get to the point where I don't know everybody anymore. Yeah.
So keeping on the theological side of things, what do the scriptures and confessions actually say about how a pastor should be trained, and who determines that what needs to be trained?
Yeah, that's great. The scriptures largely talk about personal characteristics, you'll notice. There is the knowledge of Scripture, which makes the man of God completely equipped, ready for every good work in 2 Timothy 3. But the list of qualifications laid out for a bishop or an overseer in First Timothy 3 or Titus 1 are generally personal characteristics. There's also a description of the work of the ministry. I'm just using the absolute clearest, simplest passages. Descriptions of the work of the ministry you could find in John 20, in the words of the Lord Jesus, the words of institution for holy baptism in Mark 16, or for the Lord's Supper in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or 1 Corinthians. You can go there. You also have Paul's description of what the work of the ministry is to the elders of the Ephesian congregation in Acts 20. It's not really that complex. And the modality is not specified. Obviously, it's not online in the first century AD. But, did they go away to school? No, they did not. You have schools within the first couple centuries of early Christianity. Those are always going to be in the metropolises, Alexandria, places like that. It's not clear that everybody had to go to them in order to be a pastor, and it certainly wasn't economically feasible for everybody. The confessions inherit a medieval system of university, but not everybody went to school to become a pastor prior to the Reformation. The Reformation ups the ante in pastoral education by bringing in a curriculum focused massively on the Bible for the first time. The confessions don't really reference that curriculum or those reforms, largely. The confessions lay out that the man needs to be rightly called in Augsburg 14, that the ministry must be present in Augsburg 5, and that ministry involves preaching the gospel and administering the sacraments. The way in which that happens, generally in Lutheran history, this is not scriptures or confessions, but it's where our system comes from. In Lutheran history, has to do with academic preparation and then examination by theological authorities, which early in LCMS history was the Synod president. Like the Synod president checked everybody. Today, that is each respective seminary faculty. And that's why all of our hybrid programs also run through some seminary faculty. That's why, because the seminary faculties are responsible for checking. So it's always involved academic preparation combined with some amount of practical preparation, more or less through time. And then theological authorities, sometimes a bishop, sometimes professors examining you. That's what it's always been, in order to check for the things that are really just laid out it's really the outcomes that are laid out in the scriptures and the confessions, not the modality. Yeah. And I think we have to admit that. We have to be clear about that, because I think if we started with the outcomes, we would recognize, for example, it's going to be really, really hard to get somebody who is not given to drunkenness if we don't know him personally. So if we have him in an academic situation where no professor really knows him that well, or we have him in an online situation that is synchronous and he's always good to go for class, but we don't know what's going on the ground, we have a big problem. So the scriptures and the confessions really lay out what the outcome should be, much more than the historical weight or present day debate about, which is really mostly about mode. Yeah.
So I guess I'll have to talk to someone who was in those outcome discussions. But did they? I'm just wondering if they, I'll have to see if they were talking about outcomes based on these outcomes, not whatever other outcomes they might, ready for multi-site or ready for, whatever, worship style or whatever.
That's a great point. I think that we spend enormous amounts of time, and I said this at the ACELC conference this summer, and I say this against my own camp. I say this against both camps. I think we obsess over defending current political prerogatives, and we don't obsess nearly enough over what kind of men we have. Because a lot of these other things can solve themselves and the temperature can be taken down if we agree over what kind of a man we're going to have, rather than saying, we're going to have a guy that is preaching in a tie. We're going to have a guy that is wearing a maniple, underneath the arm of his chasuble, in the correct position. Like, as long as you are stuck on things that the scriptures and the confessions are not entirely clear on, or just don't address at all, it's going to be extremely hard to reach any kind of consensus.
So, um, what from the pew sitter, from the layman's perspective,
Yeah.
what should we be looking for? What should we be asking about? What we should be expecting from pastors and the outcomes from these things.
Expect more of pastors. Expect more of pastors. I am continually amazed. And whatever, like, there are mean people in lots of different walks of life. I think sometimes pastors think that they should be treated with kid gloves. Um, Ask them what they're planning to preach on. Ask them, what did you mean when you said this in your sermon? How should I get ready as, I'm trying to tell my kids how to find a good person to marry? Ask them difficult questions. Paul tells Timothy that his progress will be evident. So, that's not a requirement for documented continuing education, but implicitly, to use an LCMS term, implicitly, I think it indicates that you are continually being educated. Like, if I'm still running a meeting or preaching, just think about any task, and I'm doing it with the same level of interest and capacity that I was 10 years ago, what am I doing? Like, expect more of us, I guess I would say. And not in an impatient way, but because you love the truth, right? Like, I think pastors should be psychotically dedicated to what we do for a living in the way that people who trade on Wall Street are. Because they are doing something which is very valuable for this life only. And then you die and you can't take it with you. Um, and they are very dedicated. They're, they're waking up on the East Coast thinking about what has happened in the, Asian markets while they were asleep. Like, I love that dedication. If I'm dedicated to the things of the life of the world to come, why am I not equally dedicated to improvement and progress, and how can I do this better? And so I think that if you look at what the scriptures and the confessions say about the outcomes, then you want to support your pastor in expecting him to progress in those outcomes. I think that's very reasonable. And I think that's born out of love. When we don't actually care about something, that's when we don't really care how well it's done or not. And I get this because I am not, I'm the world's, like, 4 billionth handiest guy. Like, I'm not, and I'm just not that interested. Like, I'm never going to be an amateur woodworker. It's not happening, like, and for me, not caring a whole lot, it's easy for me to say, it's good enough, because I don't care that much. So if it's worth caring about, if you love it, if it's about God and his truth, then I think the expectations and the performance should be high. That makes sense to me. So it's like, whatever you think about modality, the outcomes are pretty clear what they should be. Like, so if you think your pastor has a substance abuse problem, address it. you're doing that because you love him and because you love the office that he holds. Because if you don't care about him or you don't care about the office, then you don't care if your pastor's a drunk or a pothead or whatever his addiction, whatever his substance abuse problem might be. Yeah. Love has high expectations.
All right. So I was at your recommendation. I was reading Layers of the Pastor,
Yeah.
and so what I got from that, some of his description of the past seemed to be like a lot less restrictive. Like he sent out some random guy. It almost seemed like he was sending out people, a random guy, like, oh, this guy seems like a good, he's been in a church for a while. Go send him out. But then I heard Pastor Grills at the ACLC conference talk about like much more stringent paths. So what are models, were models of the, in the past brought up, or, and how could they inform our current discussions?
At the Koinonia Gathering, models from the past were not brought up except by Pastor Sundquist in his historical presentation. And that was a major deficit because Wilhelm Leah, for example, not only instigates the founding of what was originally and is now again the Fort Wayne Seminary. He also trains men himself and sends them to America from Bavaria, Germany. And they come to America and are supposed to seek recognition and ordination from some church. And so they actually end up in various synods before they mostly coalesce into the Missouri Synod or the Iowa Synod, which is one of the predecessors of the ELCA today. So, in the past, I see a past of fair variety, even in the Missouri Synod, which has one of the most centrally controlled educational systems always. Even in the Missouri Synod, we have the theoretical seminary and the practical seminary. Other synods usually have some version of like college/seminary. And in the past, those things are much more amalgamated. So the guy is graduating essentially as like a 22-year-old. Whereas now, about the youngest the guy could possibly be would be 25 when he's ordained. So because seminary is now graduate school, whereas it used to be something a lot like college. So to me, the past was more various, especially once you look outside of the Missouri Synod as to how you get pastors in Lutheran churches. But even in the Missouri Synod, you didn't have to have any formal education. You could still go to the practical seminary and show up, and they'd get you something. I mean, they'd kind of give you sort of like a high school education because you usually taught school. Like 1 out of every 2 Missouri Synod pastors pretty much taught school, more or less full time during the week. You usually taught school, and then so you needed a high school education to do that, and then you would get your kind of ministry specific stuff, preaching and stuff like that, and then you go out. So that's a pretty wide. You didn't need a degree or anything, so that differs from a lot of things today. Yeah.
So how did they keep the variation? I mean, there's educational variation was dramatic,
Yes.
But then I remember in theological, I mean, in the pastor is like one of the main things is like confessional subscription was like one of the main things you had to have. It was very, and so like, how did they do that with such varied, mechanisms?
Yeah. So Leah, writing from a German state church perspective, is in a system in his time and place that is a lot like the Missouri Synod in the United States today, where it's academic preparation and the people who give you the academic preparation examine you at the end of it. In, let's say, frontier America, or at least 19th century America, even if you're not on a frontier, enormous weight is placed on the examination. So you might have grown up not knowing any German, pretty unusual, but they would bring you even to the practical seminary. You'd have to learn enough German in order to conduct church business, because your congregation might speak English, but then you go to a conference and everybody else speaks German. So they'd give you the stuff that you need, and then they'd check you at the end. So that still exists at the seminaries, and that's called the theological interview. Honestly, by comparison to the past, it's a lot more chill. it's it's briefer, but we also spend more just years preparing people than we used to. So, but I mean, if you go back far enough, CFW Walther is going to show up and he's going to examine you. So, to me, the issue with education is often not so much about delivery method as it is about what kind of gates you have established, how many they are, and how you get through them. Because if you have the right sorts of gates, you can ensure that the synod doesn't fall into insanity by having gates where there is especially like brutal honesty and hard questions. And sometimes if you don't have that, it doesn't matter how much school you put the guy through. If he hasn't been sufficiently challenged, he's going to know how to kind of, I mean, this is how we built up Seminex inside our theoretical, academically distinguished seminary, St. Louis, at the time. We built up Seminex because guys knew how to say the right things to get through the system. So if you're not pushing guys and challenging them, regardless of what mode and how long it takes and blah, 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 if you're not pushing and challenging them and you're not, and you don't say like, no, what do you actually think? Like, is it okay for women to serve communion or not? If you don't push them, it kind of doesn't matter how much school you give them. Or how little. It doesn't matter because you're going to end up with weirdness because you didn't actually check. Like you didn't do the multi-point inspection. You just said like, "Oh, it's probably fine. I didn't hear any weird noises coming out of the engine. Probably fine." You have to have hard examination, I think, regardless of what other things you do with the educational system.
So one of the things, and you kind of put words to what I've kind of thought through, in that, like, the standard path does have a, like, they're not hard gates necessarily, but they're like, at least there's checkpoints, like your local congregation, your local pastor, your
Yeah.
fieldwork your fieldwork congregation, fieldwork pastor, your seminary, brothers, the professors, your vicarage congregation, your vicarage, pastor. I mean, it's like there's just so many more people to check you and see, like you're saying, all the parts that are the man's character. There's a lot of more people exposed to that, and then just the online side or the hybrid, whatever, you just seems like you pass so many of those soft gates.
Yeah, I don't know because it would who knows what gates
Yeah,
and that's where I'm
yeah.
saying, like, we could set this up in like a million different ways. Like if we were going to change something, we could do a million different things. The thing that I have personally seen this, is that gates are set up and the buck is passed. So like I have read a report by a vicarage supervisor and it basically says like, I don't think this guy should be a pastor, but I don't want to be the guy who makes that not happen. So I'm going to pass the buck to net, but I don't think like the faculty should certify him for placement. That's a technical term for you're ready to go. A district president can now put you in your first congregation. So that's where this is like a cultural thing more than it is a curricular thing, or it is like, again, like it's like you can teach him whatever you want to teach him. It can take however long it's going to take. You can make him go online for a bunch of core classes his first year, and then he moves, and then he does vicarage for 200 years. I mean, it doesn't matter how you set it up. If you pass the buck, you're going to have rot. That to me is a cultural thing, and we didn't talk about that at the gathering necessarily because it's not about formal stuff. I don't know how you would change that, but I have seen that over and over and over and over again. I mean, I think the buck was kind of passed on me to get into seminary because all the people who interviewed me, the pastors, a couple of their wives, had gone to seminary at St. Louis before the walkout. Remember, I'm from a saltwater district before the walkout. And they thought that I was kind of insufficiently, the word that they used was moderate. Now, I think I'm very relaxed, all things considered, considering, my background or something. But I was insufficiently moderate. They weren't willing to say, this guy is a conservative nutcase. He's not allowed to go to seminary. They could have said that. They could have. But they basically, because I had absolutely every intention of attending St. Louis, because I was told, if you don't go to St. Louis, you're never going to get back to the East Coast. And I was like, well, I like where I grew up, so I guess I have to go to St. Louis, and then blah, 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 long story. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. But what I'm saying is they kind of passed the buck. Like, they could have said, no, he can't be a pastor. And that's not absolutely definitive. If your district flunks you, it's not. But it's like really bad. Like, you have to overcome that. So passing the buck basically says, like, I don't want to be the bad guy here, and I'm glad that they didn't say he shouldn't be a pastor, because he's not, like, essentially liberal enough in Missouri Synod terms. But it doesn't matter what system you have if you have a cultural predisposition, which I have observed time and again in our system, towards not wanting to be the bad guy. I think it's much more important that you wash out guys before they get to being pastors, because the damage they do when things, and honestly, it's like the record. If you ever saw anything about the life of somebody who goes on to commit heinous crimes, they have a criminal record before then. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. If the guy's going to be a train wreck, somebody saw that he saw the wrong switch get flipped on the track sometime before this. Somebody knew this was going to happen. Maybe he couldn't say anything. Maybe he didn't say anything. But a lot of these things are fairly foreseeable, and the damage caused when that derailment occurs in the man's life, once he's already a pastor, affects way more people than if he just has to go get a different job after leaving seminary after a year or something. Like, it's much easier to have one man work in a different line of work for the rest of his days than when he's in a congregation and all of those people who think of him as God's man in that place have to see him blow up or fall apart or whatever the case may be. Yeah.
So you've touched on this before, but is there a deeper question about who gets to determine who qualifies for the ministry? Did that come up at the gathering at all? Like that kind of question, like who has the final say on who can become a pastor?
Yeah, that came up. There was, some of the points that you made in favor of the vicarage supervisor and the fieldwork congregation and stuff like that. That was actually brought up in terms of hybrid or online education, because they're like, well, the local people actually know him better, which is true about some things and not true about other things. The local people don't know his aptitude with the original languages, for example, better, generally speaking. Couple congregations where there are plenty of people who know the original languages, most of them are located in St. Louis or Fort Wayne, Indiana. Otherwise, no, they don't know that. But there are things that they know about him better. That's true. The idea that they, might, I don't know. I mean, that they somehow have a purchase on who he is, superior to more distant authorities. There's a sense in which I can see that. I mean, our seminaries are still talked about by people in the church without perspective. They are in the whole scheme of things in the United States. Concordia Seminary St. Louis is, quote, very large, according to the Association of Theological Schools, and CTS Fort Wayne is large. I know they don't feel that way. I know people don't think that there are a lot of people who don't think we should have two seminaries. Both seminaries are pretty big, objectively speaking. so so the size is not the issue. I think that the ability to assess the person is absolutely key, and I'm not really sure that any particular modality has a lock on that, apart, again, like I said, from hard gates with people who know that they can flunk people and they need to flunk some people. They just need to. Like, that's just the nature of a group of 30 people. They're not all going to be great at it. So, um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the gathering was bringing up, it was limited. It was pretty short. I'm glad they had it in Las Vegas. I'm glad I didn't have to, go to somewhere cold this time of year. But it was devoted, I think, mostly to formal questions of form, questions of mode. And I think that the disagreement about this is deeper, as your questions have rightly pointed out, is a lot of it is about outcomes and differences about outcomes, both in especially in what the man does, because that's what most congregations are going to notice. Pastor likes to play his guitar. Pastor only uses Divine Service 3. Pastor doesn't let us sing Amazing Grace anymore. And I don't know why. That's a quote from Sincerely Confused laywoman. Why aren't we allowed to sing Amazing Grace? Her words. So, and it's like, well, I don't want to throw your pastor under the bus. So, what the man does and what kind of a man he is, I think that's the thing that needs to be discussed. I don't know the venue for that. Maybe we can keep talking about it. Maybe we'll figure it out. Maybe we won't. But the gathering was mostly, and certainly the public debate is almost entirely, about form and mode. And to me, that's kind of like debating, like, well, what kind of car are we going to take on a road trip? I think the more salient question is, are we supposed to take a road trip, and where are we going to go? And once we figure that out, okay, well, we're gonna go to Death Valley. Okay, well, I want 4-wheel drive. We're going from one city to another. I don't need four-wheel drive. Maybe I want a really cool car now. Like, the form and mode stuff is much easier to answer once you figure out the substance, and the substance is a thing I'm not sure we're talking enough about.
So let's kind of talk about what might be coming up. So
Yeah.
were there any hints at the, at explicitly or implicitly about what overtures might be drafted on pastoral formation? Did people start talking in that language?
No,
Okay.
not from the dais. In conversation, yes. I'm sure there will be. I want to say we even had them in my district, which is the English district. Um, I'm pretty sure we had something on this at our district convention last year. So that stuff is definitely coming, and we will see things like that also coming from congregations and other things that are not districts, because those are obviously all over those conventions. I'm sure we will see stuff like this coming. And I think that, especially if you are not a supporter of the status quo for whatever set of reasons, I guess I'm not a supporter of the status quo, but I think it's a cultural issue. It's not something I could legislate against. So I don't have a resolution. But if I wrote a resolution, it would be like the hard gates resolution. like, if you pass too many guys through vicarage, whatever. Let me make it up on the fly to give an example. If I pass 3 vicars and 2 wash out within 5 years, I can never have a vicar again. The hard gates resolution. Let's do it. That kind of a thing, I can see a lot of that happening because, look, like, the world is not like, the LCMS cannot single-handedly say the internet doesn't exist. So until and unless the internet just goes away, number one, people will continue to talk about things publicly. And I love stuff like this because I don't see a point in acting like we all agree when we don't. I actually like that about the LCMS. I mean, I tell Wisconsin Synod people, like, I surely you guys disagree about something, but we're at least allowed to talk about it. So I like that. I like talking about it. And the internet is not going to go away in how people understand education is occurring, because pastoral education, the reason there's an adjective there is because there's an overarching reality of the noun education. And if education is changing, then pastoral education will also change. Now, that could be hardcore in the direction of residential. It could get more residential. We could say, you got to come for 6 years. Here's why. Because there are certain things about online education, which is now ubiquitous. So I can get a totally online BA and get into a residential MDiv program at an LCMS seminary. It's ubiquitous, and there are certain things about it that are becoming very sketchy. Two just points to keep in mind. One is, we got a lot of kids, even in large public school systems, relearning cursive because their teachers realize this is the only way to ensure that they develop the ability to express themselves without using AI, right? Or without using large language models specifically, okay? So it's possible that we become almost more traditional in instructional methods, and that becomes a trend affecting all levels of education. Number two, it's also possible that people who have spent a large amount of time being educated online, because, I mean, just for example, I have a buddy, his kids are fairly successful Division I athletes. They've gone to different schools across the country, different regions of the country. I think 3 different schools, 3 different regions. They have attended a physical class, like, for maybe 4 classes at 3 different institutions over 3 years. They are not, they're on campus. They're paying room and board. They are not going to a class. We're going to see a lot of people for whom that becomes normal. And very few of those people are going to want to be educated in front of a screen if they don't have to be, if residential is an option. So I don't see residential education as a dinosaur. I see it as a very long-lived model. And I think it can have a big future because you begin to offer something that is not otherwise available. Okay. I see that as this is all up for debate. Like, I have no body tension about, oh, you think online education is great. I totally get, I mean, I hope I have been extremely fair in this, in what we've talked about this evening, but I don't see online as just future oriented and residential as past oriented per se. I can see how a lot of things could change about both of those modalities in the future. And I mean, I could see a future in which we say, you're going to spend a year in your congregation. You're kind of in a process. You're going to spend a year in your congregation. You're going to knock out some just basic core courses, systematics 1, the basic confessions. Maybe you're going to do your languages. I wouldn't personally do them online, but whatever. You're going to knock out some core courses. You're already started. So your home pastor is kind of like your very first fieldwork supervisor for a year. Then you're going to come here for whatever, 3 years, whatever. And we have 2 seminaries, or we have 1 seminary, or we break it out and we have regional seminaries. Whatever. It doesn't really matter, but I don't see the modalities as one is definitely going to happen in the future, so we might as well get used to it. Or one happened in the past, so it's all we can ever do. I don't see it that way because again, I can see a lot of different things happening in the future. But I mean, honestly, talking about hybrid education has been going on in other professions for a long, long, long time. And we're just kind of getting around to it. And I'm worried we're going to be behind the curve on more traditional modes of education, that other people are going to realize sooner, oh yeah, that's actually really valuable. Like, it's really valuable to have a seminar where you all sit in the same room and just talk for 3 hours about some text. Like, that's actually much better for your brain than asynchronous learning in an online class. So I think that I want I want more discussion. I would love for people to talk about the pragmatics of this stuff. Like, what are we actually getting done when we have an online class versus when we're not? How does teaching differ? All that kind of thing. And then I think we could have a sane discussion about, do we have to do systematics 1 um, in residential formation? Can we get a lot more people started on a process of formation and then see if they actually make it to the end? And we could be more selective and we can have harder gates. I can see a lot of things happening in the future. I came away from the gathering excited about the topic, not really the political crap that I know is going to happen. I mean, obviously is already happening, like, not excited about that, but kind of excited about the options that we could have in the future. If and when, especially the political stakes of this are just lower, and people are less tense about it. I mean, we'll see if we get there, but I mean, I'm kind of excited about what could be possible. I would have loved, when I was working, between undergrad and seminary, just kind of what I would have loved if somebody had been like, you know, um, for some discounted price, you can take a seminary class online. I would have been like, oh, that's awesome. Like, I think I want to go to seminary. So like, I want to take this class. And that would have been really cool. So just a lot of different options that are out there, and I hope that we're all willing to consider it, because the discussion part of this and the openness was exhilarating. It was great to be in a room with people where you felt like you could say what you thought, and they were very chill about it. I mean, it was almost embarrassing. Like, the people at the one table I was at, they like thanked me profusely for coming, and I was like, I I mean, I didn't do anything. So, I mean, thanks for being nice, but like, I didn't earn your thanks. I'm just sitting here drinking soda. So, yeah, I mean, it was really nice. And I think that sense that we could do something bigger, especially strategically, to ensure better outcomes would be awesome.
My one caveat is, as a former regent of a college that went under because of on its entanglements with online education,
Yeah.
there's that problem, or there's a financial possible financial disaster depending on
Yes.
how you model it.
Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. And I think that what kind of exploded with Concordia Portland was the maximization of something where there's a financial incentive for any teacher and backing from any public school district for graduate degrees. And the difference being that, if you just look at this in kind of educational business terms, the market of, you know, dudes who could be LCMS pastors is so small. I, I cannot get any shady like ed tech company really involved in this. If that makes you feel better, Brian, like it's not there. You know what I mean? Like, this can never be like a shady meme coin kind of a situation, if it makes you feel better, because
I was
you're
in the
talking.
I was in the .com. I saw all the hockey stick
I
graphs.
know you
I can
saw
see
all that. Like, you've seen it all. I'm just saying, like, the market is so small. Like, you're talking about like hundreds of guys, only hundreds, alive on the earth at a given point. So I think it'll be. I think it'll be okay. I think
yeah.
it'll be okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
best case scenario,
Yeah.
what would something productive, productive convention action on pastoral formation look like?
Yeah, I think productive convention action would look a little bit like, and I don't know the backstory to all this, but it would look sort of like the process that clarified what the Concordia system was doing, like a clear demarcation between, here's kind of the business or operational end, and the Missouri Synod is not really the best place to oversee all of that, like in a direct executive sense. So we're going to rework it so the system is really geared towards keeping those Concordias Lutheran. So we're sort of accrediting, if you will, their Lutheranness in various ways. And that, I mean, people are upset about that, but I'm just saying there was clarity about what the system was for. Here are the outcomes we want to see. We want the Concordias to exist, continue existing, and to be Lutheran, like in whatever recognizable ways that we have laid out in this framework. It would kind of be the same thing where it's like, here are the guys we want. Here are the desirable outcomes. How can we how can I consult as many parties as possible? Seriously, because just upsetting people over procedural issues is like not a good thing to do, because maybe they don't even disagree with you. They just don't like that you didn't like talk to them at all. So that was a lot of the distrust in the room that I heard. So consulting as many parties as possible. What are the outcomes? Not everybody's ever going to be happy. Totally get it. What are the outcomes? Okay, here are the outcomes. How do I get there? What's the best administrative and educational structure to get there? And I think that that's always going to end up with both modalities in some form. I took online Greek. Okay. Can something go online? Can it be spread out? Can it be this? Can it be that? Whatever. You're going to be able to debate all that because you agree on what the outcomes are. Unfortunately, I think we're debating backwards in a way that seems to me to be like primed for maximum dysfunction, because you start at the end where like everybody thinks something different. Like I'm there thinking like there are certain, every week in my parish I teach a Sunday Bible class, obviously live, in a room. And then on Wednesday, I teach a Zoom Bible class, and we have people from like different states who are no longer members of our congregation. They moved it, but they're in the Bible class every Wednesday. There are things I can do online that I can't do live. That's just reality. So, but I can't have that discussion until I agree on what the outcomes are. And then we can like relax about the mode stuff. We're not going to relax about the mode stuff until we can trust each other on the outcome stuff. That's kind of what I see happening. I'm worried just, if I would never do this, but if I would create, categories on Polymarket or Kalshi or something, and I was having people voting on like what they think is going to happen. And then, it goes from like 20 cents up to 40 cents. So they make a profit, they cash out long before the Senate convention. My money would be on, we will have more voting. We will have more distrust. We might create new things, but they're going to be kind of like, a horse designed by committee. I think that's the definition of a camel, according to some people. And then those things themselves might be dysfunctional. Like that's what I'm worried is going to happen, because it's happened in the past. Or like President Harrison's going to say really clearly, like, this is like, I think this is a good idea. And then we're going to vote for the opposite thing. Like we're going to like vote for him, but then vote for the opposite thing. Like that has plenty of precedent in the Missouri Synod. So I'm worried it's going to be a mess, Brian. That's what I'm like.
Okay. That's
my
where that
betting
is
money is that it's going
okay.
to be a mess. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that should be fun. Or something. I'll have to live through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So kind of in closing.
Yeah.
So through a brief history of power,
Yes,
you've
sir.
helped me understand that we often put emotional energy in distant controversies where our concerns are really just tribal identification, right?
Yeah.
A
lot of times. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of time. But this is pastoral formation. And so it doesn't seem like it's a distant thing. So,
No.
It kind of shapes how our congregations, work.
Big time.
So it seems like something worth caring, but is the debate itself online versus, residential autonomy versus accountability? Is that where we should be thinking of it? Or, or is our bickering just another method that's distracting us from, the actual problems and stuff like that?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question because and I thought about that when I was there. I was because I thought like, I mean, I'm not here as like a delegate, so I didn't feel any responsibility to represent someone else's opinion, like or to speak for my camp, into which you were slotted in the registration process. Okay, so, and then I think you were assigned to tables. The tables were designed to ensure that every table had at least one residential advocate. That those are the proportions we were working with. Um, it's like, to some degree, that specific debate about mode of pastoral education is worth having, but it has to lead to other discussions. If it stays there, we haven't discussed, okay, the reason that I want, let's just say I take a position I didn't actually hear anybody take, but let's say I want only online education because I believe that we will never be able to educate the number of pastors we should have to preach the gospel unless we turn them out as fast as possible. And online would be the most time efficient way, especially if I did what's called competency based education, which I believe Kairos Seminary in Sioux Falls, South Dakota does, where this is a method that your listeners might be familiar with if you ever look into like Western Governors University. I think almost everything they do is competency based. So you can do your classes as fast as you want to. Like as soon as you demonstrate mastery, you can do them as fast as you want to. Um, I have an educational issue with that philosophically because I think time is actually essential to certain things that need to be learned and to certain important forms of learning. Some things can be done as fast as possible. Some things should not be done as fast as possible. And some things simply cannot be done as fast as you might desire to do them. You're not going to learn a foreign language as fast as you want to. You're going to feel like an idiot for a long time. And that's just necessary and it's part of it. But that idea, if I were going to do that, and I didn't actually hear anybody say that. Maybe somebody thought it. I didn't hear anybody say it. If I want to do that, um, that's going to have a different outcome because students get shaped by the way, not just what they are educated in, but the way in which they are educated. Students who are mostly alone in what they're learning come out differently than students who feel that they're part of some group. Students who are together from the age of 12 are different than students who are together for roughly 2 years and change on campus together the way they are today. So I think that anytime that you're talking about mode or form of education, you're ultimately talking about what that education is and whom you will produce, right? What kind of a person will be there on the other end? That's the really important question. So I don't think it's like mere bickering, but it reveals other thoughts, other ideas, other philosophies of ministry, um, other ideas about how big a congregation should be, to return to a question you had asked earlier. And until and unless we're actually talking about those, this will just be a proxy, but it will not resolve itself because the sources of the debate are not inside of the debate itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like it would be like if Congress doesn't want Trump to have another incursion into somewhere in Latin America, but instead of debating whether the president may do that without a resolution of Congress, which would be the constitutional question, they debate instead whether the president may send the Marines or the Marines and the Navy and the Air Force or just the Air Force. And that's the proxy. And to me, that's kind of what we're doing right now. Like, we actually might disagree over is multi-site ministry even thinkable or possible? Does a pastor need to know original languages? Does he need to know just one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But what we're debating is the mode. So it's not nothing, but it just reveals a lot of other things. Yeah.
So, as laymen, is there anything that we can be doing? Like, is there anything helpful that we could be doing? I
Yeah.
mean, just instead of just being performative outrage online doesn't seem like.
I mean,
what you'd like.
performative rage is at this point a time-honored American tradition. So, I think that if you care about the Missouri Synod but you're not involved in its actual political processes, get over yourself. You know, if and by political, I don't mean like if you go to a synod convention, look at the back of the room, and you'll see you could see that's like the horse trading stuff and the strategizing, like you go say this at this microphone and that kind of stuff. That's all. That's just part of the deal. That's like that's how life works. I mean, like you don't go to meetings. You might not go to your circuit forum. You're not or you never would be. Maybe you can't be, but if you can, you never. Why would you never consider being a delegate to a synod convention or serving on a board, regionally or even nationally? If you care, you need to be involved. And I say that to pastors too. I mean, because pastors tend to know a lot of the stuff that we're talking about tonight, and they complain about it, and they still don't do anything. So it's like, well, don't bother getting upset about it if you're not going to do anything to affect change. You can submit resolutions. You can serve on boards. You can do a lot of things. Generally, we have a lack of manpower for these things, rather than a surplus. So you need to be involved. If you care enough, you've listened this long, probably you're already involved. But if you're not, like, what are you doing? Like, don't listen to me talk about the Missouri Synod for 2.5 hours and then do nothing. Like that's that's so boring. Go do something. Yeah. Even if the outrage is genuine, it's not performative. Like, don't bother getting angry about stuff that you can't do anything about. But since you can do something simply by showing up, you should do it.
My insider story was during that convention the night before the election.
Yeah.
I was in Pastor Whedon's room. I don't know how I got there. I was in Pastor Whedon's room, and Dr. Mueller came in, and he was like, "I have the votes. I think we've got." He's like had been tallying and polling people. It's like, what in the world? Where am I?
You're at an election. It's elections all the way down and all the way up. I mean, that's the way it works. So, yeah. I mean. Yeah, and if you're really into that, you're really into that. If you're not really into that, there's still plenty of ways to serve, right? Because the church needs your expertise, the church needs your help, the church needs your understanding of a certain region, a certain realm of life that, whatever a bunch of pastors don't know about. Somebody who can do math really well, usually not a pastor. Stuff like that. So, you can help in all sorts of ways, even if politics per se or political processes are not your forte, or you don't share my love of Robert's Rules of Order.
All right. So do you have any final thoughts as we wrap things up?
I hope not. I mean, I think, I think that, it would be my wish that people would come away from a gathering of Missouri Synod Lutherans as hopeful as I was leaving the Koinonia Gathering. I didn't expect to be hopeful, to be honest with you. Not really because of the topic, just like I thought sort of, I've heard this all before. I'm going out of a sense of due diligence. I was actually encouraged. It was nice to meet new people, have new thoughts, all that kind of thing. That's great. I would wish that experience for other people as they go to not just the Synod convention that's coming up later this year, but local gatherings, regional gatherings. That really is because we got to talk to each other. It's not because of presentations. And, very often I am the talking head on the dais. So This is nothing against talking heads. But this sense of personal hopefulness is really born out of this, you know, talk, speaking honestly, listening honestly, and feeling that you are getting somewhere with somebody else. And so that opportunity, I hope, would be multiplied nationwide for people, because it is very it creates so much hope in you for the church, that the church might be able to talk through something that is difficult and that is complex and that will take years to work through, but we could actually get there.
All right, Koontz Sensei, thank you very much.
Brian, thank you so much.